So as I was doing my walk, as I do every single day, I had come up with this conclusion. Something came to my mind and I concluded something. And I thought it was very interesting. So it goes back to Crimea and Israel. And I was thinking, because something occurred to me last night, that technically speaking, Crimea has been in a war with Israel for almost nearly 2,000 years. Because there's a lot to unpack here, but so the Scythians defeated or destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and we talked about that in an earlier video. But the United States, quote unquote, resurrected Israel in 1948. So, and then after that, Crimea became a ground of conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So, when you look at that, there's a conflict, and this is from Iran's perspective. So, let's see what Iran thinks. So, this is Iran's point of view. Iranian migrants, or we should say Iranian, that's usually how it's portrayed. There were warriors who went to Crimea and Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan. But Crimea was there. They resided in their empire was primarily in Crimea. It was one of the most successful empires at that time. Of course, it wasn't called Crimea at the time. It was I don't know what it was called, but it was called something. I can't remember. It was like Scythian. No, it was. I don't remember what it was. Something to do with the Scythians. And they did trade with Turkey, Iran, and all that. So they defeated Jerusalem in 70 AD under the Roman Empire. They weren't part of the Roman Empire. They were contracted with the Roman Empire. With contracts. So they helped defeat Jerusalem, and that removed Israel off the map. And now we have them in 2025, where Crimea is annexed by Russia, claimed to be owned by Ukraine. Not every Ukrainian thinks that, but it's from the USSR. They had I think it has something to do with water. It was like a water trade, where it was easier to trade if Ukraine had it than Russia. That's the story that I've heard. But what had happened was, what made it what happened was 1934, I believe it was, Stalin purged Crimea from the Tatars. And this exile existed until I think it was maybe 1984. Although I think Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1984. So it could have been 1984, but it could have been in 1988. It was, I know it was somewhere in the 80s. And they exiled them. And Russians replaced. So this purge lasted all throughout the 1934 to late, I think it was late 80s. Let's actually Google that. When did or renounce exile on Crimea? I know it was sometime in the 80s because Gorbachev was president. Okay, it was 1944. May 18th, 1944. The entire Crimean Tatar population was deported from Crimea to Central Asia, accused of collaborating with the Nazis during World War II. This was part of a wider set of mass deportations by Stalin. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev denounced many of his repressive party in the secret speech. Some deported ethnic groups were rehabilitated and allowed to return to their homelands, but not the Crimean Tatars. The USSR acknowledged that the accusations were unjust, but did not allow them to return en masse. In 1967, the Soviet government issued a decree stating that the accusations against Crimean Tatars were no longer valid, but it did not restore their right to return to Crimea. So this was a sort of partial renouncement of the exile in name only, without practical consequence. Late 1980s, Perestroika era. Under Gorbachev, many Crimean Tatars began returning to Crimea, not through a single decree, but as part of broader liberalization. The movement gained strength as the Soviet Union weakened. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became independent and the returning Crimean became part of the Ukrainian state. In 1917, so you see the problem here. Now you have these, what Stalin did, they moved the Russians into Crimea. So, and they say that they're Russians, so it justified the annexation in 2014 that they were now part of Russia. And Russians, if you didn't know, Russians can go back and forth. If you're from Russia, you can go back and forth to Crimea. But there's a security border crossing in Ukraine. You can't go from Ukraine to Crimea. But there's a catch, because if you try to enter Ukraine, if you try to bypass them and go through Russia to Crimea, you will get banned from Ukraine. It's in there. I read it. It was in their statement. It wasn't, but it was part of, I know it was part of the perestroika of Gorbachev. True return began during Gorbachev's perestroika. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. The exile, they will return to the land. Which is kind of some reflective of Israel and Crimea, where exile brought people in back, where it said that after the return of Christ, the Jews will return to their homeland, which would be Israel. Right? And that happened in 1948, but that wasn't the true. We'll get into that. This will probably be like maybe a 5-part video. But I did want to ask one question about this. What was it? I don't remember, but I will say this. In 1917, could have been 1918, it was called the Autonomous. What was Crimea known as in 1917? That was before the creation of the Soviet Union in 1922. I know that they joined it. It was like, I don't know if it was voluntary. I don't remember, but I know that they chose. They war in the Crimea went through rapid political changes. So what was known as, depends on the of the Russian Empire. It was called something. I think it was called the CPR, the Crimean People's Republic. I believe that was its name at the time. Yeah, Crimean People's Republic. Here it is. After the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, Crimea became contested ground. Several governments and fractions laid claim to it. It was short-lived, aiming for autonomy or independence, but was crushed by the Bolsheviks in early 1918. The Crimea Soviet Socialist Republic, early 1918. Brief Bolshevik-controlled state set up after the fall of the Crimean People's Republic. So everyone has been trying to fight, every empire has been trying to fight for Crimea. And it wasn't until Stalin where he just threw everybody out. Well, not everybody, but most people. And he pretty much, what he turned it into, it started as a country, as an autonomous country, and it was even an autonomous state under the USSR Constitution for a while. But when Stalin got in, and he did this purging, he turned it into a country, and then it became a region. It became a region of the USSR that could just be transacted between Ukraine and Russia. So, it suddenly got dark. So what ended up happening was it was seen as a region. So when Crimea, I don't exactly know how it happened, but when Crimea became independent, Ukraine was fighting for it. They said it was original because the USSR. Well, actually, what happened because the USSR did not exist yet, and it was attached to Crimea as an autonomous state. Then it belonged to Ukraine. Crimea belonged to Ukraine, but you had the Crimean Tatar. I don't know how to say that, but you had them. And they represent their sovereign independence, right? Because that's an identity. It's not a strong identity, but it's an identity nonetheless. So you can see how they could fight about this. Is it Ukraine? Is it Russia's? Is it their own? Truth be told, because of 70-80, the way that Iran sees it, like we said here, from Iran's point of view, Crimea should be on the same level as Russia and Ukraine. It should be sovereign on its own because of what it did to Israel. So, if you want to look at legacy before Ukraine, then you would have to, and they were all once together. Ukraine, Russia, and Crimea were all the same. They were all the same land. It wasn't owned by Russia. It was all the same land. That's what I'm saying. It was from the Iranian migrants. These warriors. So, I'll end it here. Start up part 2. Thank you.